Picture this: a muddy field in France, October 25th, 1415. On one side, the flower of French nobility, thousands of knights clad in shining plate armor, confident of victory. On the other, a beleaguered, sick, and starving English army, outnumbered 3-1. It sounds like a foregone conclusion, right? But by the end of the day, the age of the armored knight, which had dominated European battlefields for centuries, would be over. And it all came down to a simple piece of wood and string, the English longbow. So how did a bunch of peasant archers make the most feared warriors in Christendom obsolete in a single afternoon? This is the story of the Battle of Agincourt, and how it changed warfare forever. To understand the revolution, you first have to understand the knight. For centuries, the mounted heavy cavalryman was the tank of the medieval battlefield. Encased in increasingly sophisticated layers of mail and plate armor, they were mobile fortresses. A cavalry charge was a terrifying, earth-shattering event, capable of smashing through infantry lines like a bowling ball through pins. Becoming a knight was a lifelong commitment. It required immense wealth for the horse, the armor, the weapons, and years of brutal training. They were the elite, the super soldiers of their day, and their dominance seemed unshakable. But in England, a different kind of military tradition was taking root. While continental Europe focused on the noble knight, England was cultivating a massive pool of professional archers. The secret weapon was the yew longbow. This wasn't your average hunting bow. Standing as tall as a man, it had a draw weight of over 100, sometimes even up to 180 pounds. To put that in perspective, a modern hunting bow is typically around 60 to 70 pounds. Pulling a longbow required incredible strength, developed through years of constant practice. In fact, English law during certain periods required all able-bodied men to practice archery on Sundays. The skeletons of longbowmen found from this era show significant physical changes: oversized left arms and bone spurs on their shoulders and wrists, all testament to a life spent mastering this devastating weapon. The result? An English longbowman could shoot 10 to 12 arrows a minute. An army of 5,000 archers could unleash a storm of almost 1,000 arrows per second. These weren't just simple pointed sticks either. They used different arrowheads for different jobs. The bodkin point was a long, thin, armor-piercing spike designed to punch through mail and find the gaps in plate armor. The sheer volume of fire was terrifying. Imagine a dark cloud descending on you, a sound like a million angry hornets, followed by the sickening thud of arrows hitting flesh and steel all around you. This brings us back to that muddy field at Agincourt. The French knights, arrogant and overconfident, saw a tired, small English army and decided on a classic, head-on charge. This was their first mistake. Recent rains had turned the battlefield into a quagmire. The narrow terrain funneled the French forces into a tight bottleneck, right into the killing ground prepared by the English. As the French advanced, Henry V gave the order. Thousands of English and Welsh longbowmen hammered sharpened stakes into the ground in front of them to protect against any cavalry that might break through, drew their bows, and let loose. The first volley was catastrophic. Arrows rained down from the sky. The heavy plate armor that was supposed to make knights invincible now became their biggest weakness. The bodkin arrows couldn't necessarily punch through the thickest parts of the breastplate, but they could penetrate visors, joints, and less protected areas on the horse. Horses, wounded and panicking, threw their riders and crashed into the men behind them. The French advance dissolved into a chaotic, screaming pileup. But the worst was yet to come. As the first wave of dismounted knights slogged through the thick mud, they became perfect targets. The sheer weight of their armor, around 60 to 70 pounds, exhausted them. They were slipping, falling, and struggling to get up in the knee-deep mud, all while a relentless storm of arrows hailed down upon them. It was less of a battle and more of a slaughter. The archers didn't even need to aim for weak spots anymore. The sheer density of the arrow storm meant hits were inevitable. Men who fell were often trampled by their own comrades pressing from behind or even drowned in the mud, unable to get up under their own weight. When the arrow supply ran low, the battle wasn't over. The English archers, lightly armored and nimble, dropped their bows, picked up mallets, swords, and daggers, and swarmed into the bogged-down, exhausted French knights. These were not peasants cowering behind a wall, they were battle-hardened soldiers. They finished the work the arrows had started, exploiting the gaps in the armor of knights who could barely move, let alone fight back effectively. The results were staggering. France lost thousands of its nobles, a blow from which its aristocracy would take generations to recover. The English losses were in the low hundreds. A single battle had demonstrated, in the most brutal way possible, that a disciplined force of common archers could systematically destroy a much larger, more elite army of knights. Agincourt wasn't the first time the longbow had proven its worth. Battles like Crécy and Poitiers had already shown its potential. But Agincourt was the nail in the coffin. It proved that the era of the knight as the undisputed king of the battlefield was over. Armor had become a heavy, expensive liability rather than an advantage. Military thinking had to change. The longbow itself would eventually be replaced by gunpowder weapons like the arquebus, which were easier to train soldiers to use. But the lesson of Agincourt endured. Warfare was no longer just the domain of the wealthy elite. Large, disciplined armies of common soldiers, equipped with the right technology and led with smart tactics, could dominate the field. The peasant with a bow had humbled the knight in shining armor, paving the way for the modern army. The age of chivalry didn't die in a grand duel. It drowned in a muddy field, under a sky black with arrows. So the next time you see a fantasy movie with an epic cavalry charge, remember the archers of Agincourt, and how in one bloody afternoon, they proved that sometimes the simplest weapon in the hands of the right people can change the course of history. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into military history, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more stories like this. Let me know in the comments what other historical battles you'd like to see covered. See you next time.